The train doors opened slowly, and for many of the men inside, this was their first glimpse of the United States. Just weeks earlier, they had been soldiers of the German army fighting across Europe under the belief that America was a ruthless and dangerous enemy. Now, exhausted, disarmed, and uncertain, they stepped onto unfamiliar soil, not as conquerors, but as prisoners of war. By 1943, thousands of German soldiers were transported across the Atlantic. The United States, facing overcrowded camps in Europe and confident in its distance from the front lines, decided to house these prisoners on its own land. For the Germans, the journey itself was filled with anxiety. Nazi propaganda had painted a grim picture. Americans were brutal and eager to punish captured enemies. Many prisoners expected harsh treatment or worse. But what they encountered instead was something entirely different. The camps they were taken to were often located in quiet rural areas, places surrounded by open fields, forests, and small towns. Barbed wire fences and guard towers were present, a clear reminder of their status, yet the environment did not resemble the prison camps many had feared. There were barracks, kitchens, medical facilities, and even recreational areas. Food was basic but sufficient. At first, the prisoners were suspicious. Kindness, they believed, had to be a trick. Some assumed it was a calculated move to weaken their loyalty. Others kept their distance, unwilling to accept that their enemy might treat them with a degree of humanity. The psychological tension was intense. Everything they had been taught clashed with what they were now experiencing. Daily life quickly settled into a routine. Wake up early, roll call, meals at scheduled times, and long stretches of waiting. For soldiers used to constant movement and orders, the stillness was unsettling. Idleness became one of their greatest challenges. Some prisoners organized classes, teaching each other languages or skills. Others played sports or created makeshift theaters to pass the time. The American guards, too, were unexpected. Many were not frontline soldiers, but older men or those unfit for combat. Their approach was pragmatic rather than hostile. They enforced the rules, but did not go out of their way to provoke or intimidate. Conversations, though limited at first, gradually began to happen. Small exchanges started to chip away at the invisible wall between captor and captive. Still, the fence remained a powerful symbol. It separated two worlds. Inside, a controlled environment where former enemies coexisted in uneasy peace. Outside, a vast country that many prisoners could barely imagine. Beyond that wire was everything they had been taught to fear, and yet, from what little they could see, it didn't match the image in their minds. Rumors began to spread among the prisoners. Some claimed that Americans lived in unimaginable wealth, with endless food and freedom. Others dismissed these stories as exaggerations. Without direct experience, it was difficult to know what to believe. And then came whispers of a new possibility, something that sounded almost impossible. Certain prisoners, it was said, would soon be allowed to leave the camps. Not to escape, not to be released, but to work. At first, the idea was met with disbelief. Leaving the camp meant exposure to the outside world, to American civilians, to a reality that had been completely hidden from them. It also meant trust, something neither side had truly extended to the other. Why would a nation at war allow enemy soldiers beyond the safety of barbed wire? The answer lay in necessity. With millions of American men deployed overseas, the country faced a severe labor shortage, especially in agriculture. Crops needed to be harvested, fields maintained, and production sustained to support the war effort. The solution, though unconventional, was already outlined in international law. Prisoners of war could be used as labor, as long as they were treated fairly. For the first groups selected, the experience would change everything. They would step beyond the fence into open landscapes, working alongside the very people they had been taught to hate. They would see homes, families, towns, real life unfolding in ways that contradicted years of propaganda. And slowly, their understanding of the world would begin to shift. All they knew was that the gates, which had always remained closed, might soon open. And when they did, nothing would be the same again. The gates did not open all at once. At first, it was only a small group, names called out during roll call, men stepping forward with uncertainty written across their faces. No one fully understood what was happening. Rumors had spread for days, but now it was real. They were being told to prepare to leave the camp, under guard, with instructions, and with a warning. Any attempt to escape would be met with immediate consequences. For the prisoners selected, the moment was tense. Some felt a quiet sense of relief at the chance to break the monotony of camp life. Others were deeply suspicious. Why them? Why now? A few even feared it could be a test, a trap designed to expose disloyalty or weakness. Years of indoctrination had taught them not to trust the enemy, no matter how reasonable the situation appeared. The guards, however, treated it as routine. Trucks were prepared, tools were loaded, and the prisoners were organized into work details. There was no dramatic build-up, no visible sign of danger, just a process, efficient and controlled. And then, for the first time since their capture, these men passed through the gates not as confined prisoners, but as part of something unexpected. They were leaving. The journey itself was short, often just a few miles into the surrounding countryside. As the trucks moved away from the camp, many prisoners looked out in silence. What they saw challenged everything they had imagined. There were no ruined cities, no visible signs of chaos or desperation. Instead, there were farms stretching across the landscape, well-kept houses, open roads, and people going about their daily lives. It didn't look like a nation consumed by war. When they arrived at their destinations, the reality became even more surprising. Farmers, factory supervisors, and local workers were waiting for them, not with hostility, but with cautious curiosity. These civilians had been told that German prisoners would be assisting with labor. For many Americans, this was just as strange as it was for the prisoners. The idea of working side by side with enemy soldiers was something few had ever imagined. The first interactions were stiff and uncertain. Language barriers made communication difficult, and both sides were careful. The guards remained present, watching closely, but they did not interfere unless necessary. The prisoners were given tools, shown their tasks, and expected to work. And they did. In the fields, they planted, harvested, and maintained crops. In some areas, they helped repair equipment or worked in small production facilities. The labor was physical but familiar. Many of the prisoners had come from rural backgrounds before the war. For them, this was not entirely new work. What was new was the environment in which they were doing it. There was no shouting, no immediate threat, no constant pressure beyond the expectation to complete the job. As hours passed, something subtle began to change. The initial tension slowly eased. A farmer might gesture to demonstrate a task more clearly. A prisoner might nod in understanding. Small moments of cooperation replaced silent suspicion. Words were few at first, but communication didn't always require language. Shared effort created its own understanding. Breaks became another point of quiet transformation. In some cases, prisoners were allowed to sit in the shade, drink water, and eat simple meals. Occasionally, these meals were not entirely separate from those of the civilians. The act of eating in proximity, once unthinkable, began to feel almost normal. For the guards, this system depended on discipline and trust. They were responsible for ensuring that no one attempted to escape, Yet they also understood that excessive force would undermine the entire operation. Most prisoners, aware of their situation and far from home in an unfamiliar land, had little desire to run. Escape meant navigating a vast country where they didn't speak the language and had no support. So they stayed. Day after day, the routine repeated. Leave the camp in the morning, work through the day, return by evening. The gates that once symbolized confinement now marked the beginning and end of something far more complex. Each trip outside exposed the prisoners to a version of America that directly contradicted what they had been taught. They saw ordinary people, not enemies, not monsters, living stable, structured lives. They saw abundance where they had expected scarcity. They saw order where they had imagined chaos. And perhaps most unsettling of all, they experienced a level of trust. Not complete freedom, not equality, but a controlled form of responsibility that placed them closer to civilians than to prisoners locked behind wire. The guards did not treat them as friends, but neither did they treat them as less than human. The civilians, too, began to adjust. What started as wary observation slowly shifted into something more practical. These men were workers, and the work needed to be done. But beneath the surface, questions began to grow. If the enemy behaved this way, what else might be untrue? For some prisoners, the answer was uncomfortable. It meant reconsidering beliefs that had once seemed unquestionable. For others, it created a quiet internal conflict, loyalty to what they had been taught versus the reality unfolding in front of them. By the time they returned to camp each evening, they carried more than physical exhaustion. They carried new impressions, new doubts, and new experiences that could not easily be ignored. The gates would close behind them, just as they always had, but now they knew what existed beyond them. And that knowledge was beginning to change everything.
By the time the work details became routine, the fear had mostly faded, but something else had taken its place: familiarity. What had once felt unnatural now became part of daily life. The trucks arrived, the gates opened, and the prisoners stepped out with less hesitation than before. The unknown was no longer beyond the fence. It was something they experienced every single day. The work itself was demanding, but it carried a strange sense of normalcy. In the fields, the rhythm of planting and harvesting followed patterns many of the prisoners already understood. Seasons dictated the pace. Weather shaped the day. There was a beginning, a task, and an end, something clear and tangible, unlike the uncertainty of war or the stillness of camp life. For many, this routine brought a sense of purpose they hadn't realized they were missing. Farmers relied on them. Crops needed to be gathered before they spoiled. Equipment had to be maintained. The success of the harvest often depended on the effort of these prisoners, and that dependence created a subtle but important shift. They were no longer just captives, they were contributors, even if only temporarily. The interactions with civilians began to change as well. At first, communication had been limited to gestures and basic instructions, but over time, simple words were exchanged. English phrases were picked up quickly: numbers, tools, directions. In return, some Americans became curious, attempting a few words in German or asking questions in slow, careful speech. Conversations were awkward, often fragmented, but they were real, and with each exchange, the distance between enemy and person grew smaller. Some farmers, especially in rural areas, began to treat the prisoners with a level of practical respect. Not friendship, not equality, but something grounded in shared work. A man who worked hard, followed instructions, and showed reliability earned a certain level of trust. That trust might be as small as being handed better tools or being allowed to work with less supervision. They had been told these people were enemies, yet here they were, working side by side, sometimes even sharing silence in a way that felt almost peaceful. Not every interaction was positive. Some civilians remained hostile, refusing to speak to them at all. The tension never fully disappeared, it simply became less constant. Among the prisoners themselves, reactions varied. Some embraced the change, adapting quickly to the environment and finding comfort in the routine. Others remained cautious, keeping emotional distance. A few struggled internally, feeling that any sense of ease or connection was a betrayal of their country and beliefs. But even for the most resistant, the experience was difficult to ignore. They were seeing things firsthand, things that contradicted years of messaging. American farms were productive, organized, and often well-equipped. Families appeared stable, not oppressed or fearful. Children played openly. And perhaps most striking of all, there was food, not just enough to survive, but often in abundance. Meals during workdays, while simple, were consistent. Slowly, the routine began to reshape perspectives. The prisoners were not being re-educated through lectures or force. Instead, the change happened quietly, through repetition. Day after day, interaction after interaction, expectation after expectation being challenged by reality. The fence still existed, the guards were still present, the war was still ongoing. But within that structure, something unexpected was happening, a kind of understanding, not complete, not universal, but growing. By the end of each day, as the prisoners returned to the camp, conversations among them began to shift. They spoke not just about the work, but about what they had seen. Some dismissed it, insisting it was temporary or staged. Others weren't so sure, because the experience repeated itself the next day and the day after that. It became harder and harder to believe that it was all an illusion. The work continued, the routine held, the gates opened and closed as they always had. But inside the minds of those who walked through them each day, something far more significant was shaping. Not at once, not dramatically, but steadily. And it was changing everything they thought they knew. The prisoners began to notice things they had never considered before. Small details, ordinary moments, carried unexpected weight. Children waving from a distance, neighbors greeting one another. The steady rhythm of daily life, these glimpses of normalcy contrasted sharply with the images drilled into them by years of propaganda. America was not a land of chaos and cruelty, as they had been taught. It was orderly, organized, and in many ways surprisingly humane. Conversations became more common. A few words here, a nod there, gestures of cooperation, they all chipped away at the rigid framework of enemy and ally that had governed their thinking. Some prisoners began to ask questions about families, traditions, and even religion. They learned that ordinary Americans shared concerns, hopes, and fears that were not so different from their own. In the fields, among the crops and machinery, they glimpsed a reality that was human, not monstrous. Even the guards, once symbols of authority and separation, became part of this subtle transformation. While maintaining discipline, many treated the prisoners with fairness and a degree of respect. They corrected mistakes without cruelty, allowed minor choices, and sometimes even offered small advice or guidance. It was not friendship, but it was acknowledgement of competence and humanity, a stark contrast to the enemies they had been conditioned to fear. The workday offered unexpected lessons in trust. When left to complete tasks with minimal supervision, many prisoners realized they were capable of responsibility. Mistakes were corrected, tasks completed, and slowly they internalized a sense of accountability. Trust was being extended to them cautiously, and they responded in kind. With each successful day, the invisible barrier between prisoner and civilian weakened. Over time, the prisoners' beliefs about the enemy began to shift. The stark line between us and them blurred. Those who had fully embraced Nazi ideology found themselves confronting uncomfortable truths. They saw individuals who were kind, fair, and hard-working, traits that did not fit the caricature of the cruel American they had been taught to despise. Others, less ideologically rigid, felt relief that the people around them were not the monsters they had feared. This transformation was not immediate. It was subtle, cumulative, and often resisted. Some prisoners clung stubbornly to their previous beliefs, reminding themselves of the war and their duty. But the experiences of day-to-day life could not be ignored. Meals shared, labor completed, and small acts of consideration were impossible to reconcile with the rigid hatred they had been taught. Letters sent back to Germany reflected these changes in perspective. Prisoners described the unexpected civility of American civilians, the fairness of the guards, and the work that was given to them. They described sights and experiences that did not match Nazi propaganda. Those letters, censored though they were, sometimes influenced families' perceptions of the enemy as well. What began as a personal shift had ripple effects far beyond the camp. Even simple routines took on new meaning. Watching crops grow, participating in community labor, and seeing results from their own effort gave prisoners a sense of purpose that was absent during combat or in the confines of camp life. They began to measure time not by danger or fear, but by tasks completed and lessons learned. The world outside the fence was complex, structured, and human, and their understanding of it evolved with each passing day. By the time the prisoners returned to the camp at night, they were not the same men who had left that morning. Experiences outside the fence created new ways of thinking, new moral reflections, and subtle empathy. For many, it became impossible to return fully to the rigid mindset of war. They had glimpsed an alternative reality, one where ordinary people could coexist, even in the midst of conflict, with decency and trust. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the enemy they had feared was not a monster. Humanity existed on both sides, and understanding it was the first step towards reshaping their own beliefs. The transformation was quiet, daily, and profound, and it was only beginning.
The war eventually ended, but the experience of daily life outside the camp left a lasting impression on the prisoners. Repatriation was both a relief and a challenge. For many, the journey back to Germany meant leaving behind not only the land where they had worked, but also the routines, small freedoms, and human connections they had grown to rely on. They returned to a country scarred by conflict, hungry for recovery, and often suspicious of those who had been away, unsure how to reconcile the past. Letters and stories circulated among former prisoners, recounting moments that had seemed impossible during the war. They described farms in bloom, families living without fear, and communities that had treated them with unexpected fairness. Some wrote of civilians who had shared meals, offered guidance, or spoken in simple gestures of understanding. These were not grand acts of heroism. They were ordinary gestures, yet they carried extraordinary meaning for men who had been trained to see only enemies. They also spoke of the quiet lessons learned from cooperation and trust, things that could never be taught in a classroom or military drill. Reunions years later sometimes highlighted how transformative the experience had been. Former prisoners returned to the towns where they had worked, meeting Americans who remembered them as workers, neighbors, or simply as people. Some established lasting friendships based on shared labor and mutual respect. These encounters challenged assumptions on both sides, proving that war did not have to erase human connection. They shared stories with younger generations, ensuring that the experiences and lessons were remembered beyond their own lifetimes. The lessons learned were subtle but profound. The men who had once believed in absolute divisions between us and them now carried evidence to the contrary. Trust, cooperation, and empathy were not weaknesses, they were qualities that allowed communities to function even amidst global conflict. Many former POWs later reflected that these experiences had reshaped their worldview more than the battles they had fought. They had seen firsthand that ordinary people, even in the midst of war, could act with decency and understanding. Even decades later, the memory of working beyond the gates remained vivid. It was a reminder that humanity could survive war, that everyday life could teach lessons of respect and understanding, and that personal experience often outweighed ideology. The simple act of labor, of cooperation, and of observing ordinary people living ordinary lives left a mark that could never be undone. It became a touchstone in their memories, proof that trust and dignity could persist even in the darkest times. For those who had crossed the fence, the world had become a larger, more complex place. Enemy lines blurred, propaganda lost its power, and the capacity for empathy endured. The camps had once confined their bodies, but the daily journey outside expanded their minds. And in the quiet moments, as they remembered those days in fields and factories far from home, they understood something essential. Even in war, humanity could persist. The experiences shaped their lives, influenced their decisions, and guided their understanding of freedom, respect, and human connection. The gates were finally open for good, but the true journey, the transformation of perception, understanding, and belief, continued long after the war ended. What began as forced labor became an unintentional bridge between worlds, proving that small, everyday encounters could reshape hearts, minds, and the legacy of war itself. It showed that even in times of conflict, ordinary acts of trust and cooperation could create lasting change, echoing far beyond the fences of any camp.